2 years on, who is winning the Russia-Ukraine war? Maybe it's neither. From the latest numbers, it seems big U.S. corporations have been carrying the day. A fact sheet released last month by the U.S. State Department shows that U.S. arms transfers and defense trade hit a record $240 billion last year, up 16% year on year, as quote-unquote countries sought to replenish stocks sent to Ukraine and prepare for major conflicts. U.S. President Joe Biden has bluntly told media that U.S. aid to other countries, so-called aid to other countries and regions, supports American jobs through arms production. Meanwhile, U.S. energy exports to Europe have also shot up as Russian supplies were cut off. Is the U.S. profiteering from the war in Ukraine, whether or not inadvertently? Is peace then bad for business? What's the implication for China? Welcome to a special edition of The Point with me, Li Xin. I'm pleased to be joined from Beijing by Zhou Bo, Senior Fellow at the Center for International Strategy and Security of Tsinghua University. From Bangkok, Thailand, Brian Berletic, former U.S. Marine and geopolitical analyst. And from Washington, D.C., Peter Kutznick, History Professor and Director of the Nuclear Studies Institute at American University. Gentlemen, welcome to The Point. So, as I mentioned, this number, a record of $240 billion of arms sales by the United States in 2023, up 16%. That includes two chunks: foreign military sales, which is $81 billion, that's 60% up year on year, the highest ever, and direct commercial sales, $158 billion, up 2.5%. Mr. Zhou, let me go to you first. What is the difference here? How should we understand the foreign military sale and direct commercial sales?
I think the United States obviously is the largest arms seller in the world. In the past, it was followed by Russia, but Russia's arms sales certainly has declined tremendously. So that is kind of a profit making that would meet the interest of American politicians as well as the military industrial complex. Yeah, but then there is another thing, that is American foreign policy. That of course is heavily involved. For example, in two wars. Yeah, both in Ukraine and in the Middle East. So that is totally different. Right now, we're seeing the United States, specifically President Biden's additional plan of aiding Ukraine, very much stored in Congress. So putting all this together is a very complex picture.
Brian, help us understand if you can. I was pointing to the $81 billion of foreign military sales, which is up 60%. Why the historic jump in your eyes? And what does that say? That the overall arms sales by the United States is 16% higher year on year, hitting a record high of $240 billion.
I don't think that it's a secret that U.S. foreign policy is heavily motivated by accumulating profits for U.S. corporations and financial institutions, but also this desire to expand power globally. So they go hand in hand. And it might not necessarily be the central factor motivating U.S. support for this conflict in Ukraine, but it most certainly is a major benefit. And we can even hear officials, representatives in Washington promoting this idea of profiting from this war and thus using that as justification to continue supporting the war.
Professor Kutznick, help us understand here, because there are various terms that are being floated out there. We see military aid, we see security assistance with Ukraine or to Ukraine, and then we have what people are calling military sales or defense trade. What are we talking about? For instance, the $240 billion, is that military assistance to Ukraine? Is that military aid to Ukraine, or arms sales? I mean, related to Ukraine and of course other countries who are willing to buy it.
Probably all of the above. What's involved, U.S. military support is logistic support, intelligence support, it's training on weapon systems. I mean, in addition to the arms sales, the weapon sales, this is all part of the U.S. aid to these countries. Now, very important for Ukraine so far has been the U.S. intelligence support and the NATO intelligence support, helping them with targeting, helping them with knowing where troops are located, where targets are located. That's essential on top of the weapon systems. So the U.S. has provided one weapon system after another. Initially, Biden says he's not going to provide them because he's afraid it's going to expand the war, and then he ends up providing them. Right now, the Ukrainians are waiting on the F-16s. And Stoltenberg, the NATO head, said recently that it's fine for Ukraine to attack Russia aggressively inside of Russia once these weapons are available. So that's part of the danger with the increasing weapon sales, more sophisticated weapons sales, increasing Ukraine's capability, the fantasy that somehow Ukraine is going to survive 2024 and go on the offensive in 2025. I mean, it's crazy talk, but that's what a lot of the American military planners are counting on in Ukraine in 2024 and 2025.
What I'm trying to say is it seems that there is confusion here among the general public, both domestically in the United States and for us watching from outside. For instance, when you're talking about military aid, when you're talking about support, you're helping someone. But if you're talking about trade, if you're talking about sales, they have to pay for the stuff you're giving them, you're providing them. Mr. Zhou, so what is the primary, if you can help us understand, what is the primary form of provision from the United States to Ukraine? Are they selling the weapons that they say will help Ukraine fight the war, or are they giving them at least at a discounted price? And who are paying for these weapons? Are the U.S. taxpayers or Ukrainian taxpayers?
Well, I think the United States is just providing them, the Ukrainians free military assistance. Because when we talk about the military trade and the military assistance, that's really two different concepts. For example, China will also, do both. So that is perfectly understood. Yeah, but I don't believe Ukraine can actually pay back whatever is offered. But actually, this kind of assistance from the United States would account for very low the sum of American GDP, according to, for example, some American columnist. Yeah, so this is affordable, but there is also another, debate how affordable this can be, especially when the Ukrainians actually have obviously suffered. Yeah, in the so-called counter-offensive. So I believe that in the battlefield, the situation has really turned negative for Ukrainians to the extent that I don't believe they would actually win over Russia. The prospect is gone.
Well, I really want to get the concepts of what we're talking about here clear. So, Brian, do you agree that it's U.S. taxpayers who are by and large funding the kind of military equipments that the United States is sending to Ukraine? And what about to the neighboring countries who are also replenishing their stocks to support Ukraine? Because if Ukraine doesn't have the money to pay for the weapons, these countries should have. So are the bills totally footed by U.S. taxpayers, or part of it? Are we really talking about aid as some kind of humanitarian or moral help, or are we talking about business here?
We have seen many different arrangements announced, and supposedly Ukraine is buying or will eventually pay back the United States. But at the same time, the US and Europe are subsidizing all activities of the Ukrainian government. So what money are they going to pay it back with? Ultimately, it'll be European and American taxpayers who pay for all of this, which is an irony because we continuously hear from Washington that this war is good for the United States, good for business. It's good for the arms manufacturers. It really is not aid because the conflict in Ukraine is essentially a proxy war. The US overthrew the elected government of Ukraine in 2014, and they created a client regime in its place to antagonize and provoke Russia. And the United States and the rest of NATO, quite frankly, they are fighting Russia through the Ukrainians. It is an absolute catastrophe for the Ukrainians, the European and American public. The only people profiting, as you've mentioned, are these arms manufacturers and the politicians that serve them.
So, Professor Kuznick, do you agree that it's by and large U.S. taxpayers who are footing the bills for the so-called U.S. military aid to Ukraine, and that explains why the Biden administration actually and its officials have to go on the national media to persuade the American public that a lot of the money is actually coming back to the United States. For instance, the Wall Street Journal reported that one of the senior Biden administration official told the media that that's one of the things that's misunderstood, how important that funding is for employment and production around the country. They're talking about 60 billion US dollars they want for Ukraine among a 95 billion supplemental defense bill that passed through the US Senate earlier this month. Professor Kuznick, your take on this?
Yes, this is absolutely being financed by the American taxpayers. And the point you're making is correct. Recently, in the statements calling for that aid, Biden and Victoria Nuland and Jake Sullivan have all been stressing that this money goes right back into the United States economy, which means it goes back into the pockets of these arms makers who during the 30s, after World War I, were called merchants of death. These people profit. The more people who get killed, the more bombs, the more drones, the more missiles, the more ammunition. This is the profit figures for these people. They make extraordinarily high profits, and then it doesn't go into the research and development that it used to go into and is supposed to go into. It goes into their pockets. So this is I think, the highest form of immorality, profiting off war, profiting off killing, profiting off of death and destruction. And in the case of Ukraine, that money is being financed by American taxpayers. With Taiwan and Israel also comes out of the pockets of American taxpayers. With Taiwan, probably more of it is being paid for by the government of Taiwan.
Well, not just that, what I find really troubling, and I cannot understand this, honestly, I think very, very hard. I just cannot understand because not only the United States is making huge profit, whether it seeks it or not is a different matter, but they are making huge profit. And they're telling the world that Americans are not dying because of this, it's Ukrainians are dying for this. For instance, the Wall Street Journal wrote very recently that while war often has economic spin-offs, these are occurring without U.S. actually doing any of the fighting. This is written, you know, black on you know, it's printed for the world to see. And just now, Mr. Joe also talked about the columnist, which is William Burns, I guess, the CIA director, telling the world that with a very small investment by the United States, less than 5%, the United States is scoring huge geopolitical gains. Mr. Joe, it seems that the U.S. government, the Biden administration at this moment, have no qualms about announcing to the world they are making a profit and no Americans are dying and Russia is being weakened and they're fine with it.
No, I don't think so, because these kind of things are always, arguable. For the United States, actually, the focus right now is China, and these two will actually have siphoned away their attention, and to a lesser extent, the financial burden. I was not quoting, Nicholas Burns. I was actually quoting Paul Krugman, the Nobel, economic prize winner.
Bad.
So
Yeah.
he should be accurate on such figures. Yeah. So for the United States, the economic burden yeah, because of the war is actually very small, but they have to consider a lot of things because the United States describe Russia as a kind of a a immediate threat, while they describe China as a pacing threat. So these two wars actually have very much distracted American attention. So, but as to how long the war will last, nobody would actually know. I think the difference is, yeah, no one knows when the war in Ukraine will come to an end, and in the Middle East, nobody knows when a war that has once stopped will crop up again, and that is the difference for me.
So, does the United States want the war in Ukraine, or is it in the interest of the United States for the war in Ukraine to drag on or to stop? Because to stop would mean loss of businesses for the corporations, less jobs for the Americans, Mr. Joe.
I think the general American impression and the impression of the West is that they cannot afford to lose the war. Yeah, and they deny that they have actually triggered the war. But I would believe that they actually have triggered the war because of something happened a long time ago. Because it's not that Putin actually has launched just launched the war. It actually is actually the fact that all the Soviet leaders, starting from Mikhail Gorbachev down to Boris Yeltsin, down to Vladimir Putin, have all warned against this kind of what they perceive to be NATO threat. And Putin is different from his predecessor in that he not only warned against this kind of a threat, but he is a man who actually has carried out military operations, and that is the difference. So when we talk about this war, we can just not see, okay, what is happening on the ground and what will happen in the future. But we have to think about the root causes. You see, Russia would not move away, and Europe would not move away. So Russia and Europe have to live together, and this war has already fundamentally changed the security architecture of Europe as a whole.
Well, it's certainly very, very complicated. Brian, do you think more as time passes, more people in the West, including more people in America, start to see that it's not black and white, and hence they are expressing less support for U.S. providing so much assistance to Ukraine? Because according to the polls, you're seeing a decline of support for U.S. policy at this moment.
American public support for any U.S. war is predicated on the success of the U.S. media's propaganda campaigns. The only reason Americans think that this is a good idea is because the media told them. Of course, provoking a war on the other side of the planet is not a good idea. It is not good for Americans. It's not good for their European allies. Creating this conflict with Russia was not a good idea. And despite the sales pitch that this is making Russia weaker, I think we could see all across Western headlines now, even they are admitting that Russia is stronger now than before this conflict began. So the premise that this was all built on, sold with, that is all crumbling. And I think that is why Americans are starting to shift in opinion. They're starting to realize that, yes, once again, the U.S. government, with the help of the U.S. corporate media, have lied to them. The U.S. has a very limited amount of time to push these agendas forward before the American people start to see through. We saw this with Afghanistan, Iraq, and now Ukraine.
Professor Kuznick, do you think that it is becoming harder and harder for the Biden administration, for the U.S. government, to persuade the American people, 1/3 of which, and increasingly, want to reduce so-called military aid for Ukraine?
For two reasons. First of all, there's a strong isolationist tendency in the United States that Donald Trump has tapped into. So the MAGA people, the MAGA faction, the Republican Party, the Trump supporters are much more hesitant or resistant to giving money to Ukraine, not only because it's a futile effort, but because they don't like giving money to foreign governments in any capacity. Then there's other people who are concerned because they're opposed to the war and they see what's happening there. And Ukraine, despite what Zelensky says, whether it's in Munich or the G7, Ukraine is doing terribly at the moment. The Russians are advancing, and internally there's a lot of turmoil. He just fired Zaluzhny, his commander-in-chief there, replaced him with Sersky, a man whose nickname is the Butcher, who's very unpopular with the troops, and they're retreating. And so all of the happy talk is coming out, is seeming very, very hollow at the moment. In addition, but the American media is filled right now with anti-Russian uh, articles, with people, all the people on the mainstream television channels. First, the Tucker Carlson interview, then Navalny's death, then these reports about Russian nuclear weapons in space, which is crazy, but one negative story after another. And so the American people in the polls indicate that they want to see a negotiated settlement. And I think they have a sense that we could be back here in a year from now with 500,000 more people dead and still a relative stalemate on the battlefield. The Ukrainians are not going to drive the Russians out of Ukraine. And the Russians, are winning at the moment, but they're at a tremendous cost.
Mr. Zhou, what is your assessment, just to have another perspective maybe, what is your assessment of who's winning on the battlefield? The Ukrainians or the Russians, or there's a stalemate? What is your observation?
At the last year's Munich Security Conference, the Deutsche Welle, the German TV interviewed me and they quote me as a title, that is, Putin will not lose the war, nor will he win the war. And I believe I'm still right in saying that, because in the battlefield, right now, Russia is having the upper hand. But actually, Russia is really fighting against, Ukraine, that is fully supported by US-led NATO. Because the US-led NATO believes that they cannot afford to lose. So this war will just drag on. So the question is whether, Trump might be reelected, because he said something like, if I'm re-elected,
Right.
I can resolve this issue in 24 hours.
Yeah.
But what does that mean? That gives you a lot of imagination. That means, the United States has to do a deal with Russia. It's always my belief that actually this kind of negotiations is never between Moscow and Kiev. It eventually will be between Washington and Moscow.
Well, while the battle goes on, it seems that huge profits, the so-called economic spin-off, will continue to roll in. And we are also looking at Israel. The U.S. approved a nearly $15 billion bill last November, committing $14 billion this month to support Israel's operations. And there are two packages, so altogether worthy of $30 billion in total. And before that, an annual $3 billion of aid, so-called aid, is given to Israel. Brian, are we looking at a similar picture in terms of gains for the corporations in the defense and space contractors?
Yes, this is how the arms industry in the United States make their money, by selling weapons all around the world, fueling conflicts that the U.S. has ultimately engineered or underwrites. That is exactly what's going on in the Middle East. But beyond profits, the United States seeks to destabilize all of these regions of the world: Europe, the Middle East, Asia Pacific, because all of these regions are moving on out from under U.S. primacy. They're making their own decisions. They're moving on without Washington. The best way for Washington to reassert itself, because it excels in manufacturing arms and producing conflicts, it is to destabilize these regions in the hope that it can reassert itself, as it has in Europe. It has very successfully done it in Europe. They want to replicate this.
When it comes to Taiwan, it seems there's a diverging trend between what the U.S. says and what the U.S. is doing. For instance, U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan was talking about stabilizing relations with China and taming what U.S. policy is concerning that region. But on the other hand, Professor Kuznick, the U.S. announced just days ago that it's approved military sales to Taiwan of a so-called Advanced Tactical Data Link System upgrade planning and related equipment for an estimated cost of $75 million. What exactly is that system that's being sold now?
Well, the Link 16 system allows for real-time communication between the allies in a military situation. It enables interoperability between the various militaries. So the Americans, NATO, South Korea, Japan, Australia could all be communicating in real time in an operation over Taiwan, for example, or to defend Taiwan if China moves militarily.
If the mainland, yeah.
So, but that's the assumption.
Okay.
But we see all these warnings. Rand Corporation issued a report back in 2015 saying that the fighting would likely occur by 2025. We had General Minihan recently saying he thinks the U.S. and China will be at war by 2025. Admiral Davidson had said 2027, but we see the U.S. preparing for war in the Pacific. The U.S. has militarized that. 4 more bases in the Philippines, the AUKUS arrangement, the Quad, closer ties with South Korea now that Yoon's in charge there. It's a very, very ominous situation. And there's no guarantee from an American standpoint that the Americans would win a military confrontation with China.
Mr. Zhou, let me come to you to wrap up these questions. What does it mean for the U.S. to approve sales of so-called Link 16 system to Taiwan? Does it mean that the U.S. is treating Taiwan as a quasi-NATO partner?
No, I don't think so. I think the United States is really trying to turn Taiwan into a so-called porcupine. So no matter how they talk about one China, which is we always do, but they're actually trying to provide more and more military assistance to Taiwan. But the real question is, how much does all this kind of military assistance would really matter for mainland China? I don't think so, because for 2 obvious reasons. Number 1, Taiwan would not move away. Number 2, time is on the side of mainland China. We still harbor this good intention of peaceful reunification, but we have to prepare for the worst.
Well, meanwhile, again, for arms sales, for the big weapons industry, this is good business. And you're also hearing president of the so-called U.S. Taiwan Business Council chairman talking about U.S. should upgrade its Coast Guard ships and give the existing ones to Taiwan so that they can patrol the so-called Taiwan Strait. Anyway, I'm running out of time for this discussion. We talk about it next time. Many thanks to my guests, Mr. Zhou Bo, Brian Berletic, and Professor Peter Kuznick joining me for this special edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin. As always, you can follow me on Facebook and Twitter using the handle Liu Xin in Beijing. On behalf of the whole team, thank you for watching. You've got the point.